Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. This module is entitled Freshwater Biodiversity, Temporal as well as Spatial Patterns. As you know, the freshwater of the world is entirely limited. We have only very limited number of resources for the freshwater, and most of the freshwater is locked up almost forever in the ice sheet, which is kilometers thick ice sheets of Antarctica. Two ice sheets of Antarctica as well as one in the Greenland. So we have the whole freshwater resources of the world is just 0.01% of the whole aquatic resources, but it do support immense number of organisms, especially animals as well as terrestrial plants. So the aquatic bioresources is extremely important resource, and aquatic biodiversity itself is very important among the global biodiversity. In this module, we will be covering major aquatic ecosystems, especially lentic, that is actually stagnant waters, the lacustrine system, for example, the lake system, then lotic, that is actually moving, mobile or dynamic running waters, for example, riverine system, riparian system. All these are actually part of the lotic system, that is actually dynamic systems. We will also be covering about some overlooked, extremely overlooked biodiversity spots, including aquifers, that is actually groundwater aquifers. Recent research have revealed that even groundwater aquifers, which is pitch dark year round, do support a number of interesting life forms. So we will be covering that biodiversity of the aquifers as well here. Another overlooked place on the earth is of course Antarctica, and other glaciers do support certain unique life forms that we will be covering up here. Wasteland as well, the wetland as well. Earlier we used to call it as wasteland, and nowadays it has become more and more clear that these wetlands are a hotspot and is extremely important for the global biodiversity. We'll also be covering certain threats that the anthropogenic activity is exerting on the freshwater biodiversity. So we'll be concluding with threats, that the anthropogenic threats that the global freshwater biodiversity is currently facing. So first we will see the learning outcomes of today's presentation is to learn the overview and the importance of the freshwater biodiversity, to learn about various ecosystem goods and services provided by the freshwater biodiversity, to learn about zonal classification of the freshwater biodiversity, to learn about various lentic, lotic, aquifer, glacier systems of the world, and to learn about the threats and challenges that we are faced with the global freshwater biodiversity. Freshwater is defined as the water with the salinity less than 0.05%. So in terms of PPT, that is parts per thousand, it is 0.5. So there is 0.5 grams per kilogram of water, or 1 liter of the water. You put 0.5 grams of sodium chloride. As you see, it is very less salty. So less than 0.05% or 0.5% is what you call as fresh water. So, and as per this definition, fresh water doesn't mean that total absence of salt. So it is extremely unlikely to find any natural water resource which is absolutely pure. Salinity between 0.5 ppd to 30 ppd is termed brackish water, which is found in estuaries or river mouths, and typical salinity of the sea water is 31 to 38 ppd, which is quite high, as you can see. Freshwater resources of the world, merely 0.01% of the all aquatic resources encompass freshwater resources. 98% of the freshwater resources locked up in massive ice sheets of the Antarctica and the Greenland. Freshwater occupy 0.8% of the water surface, yet it supports 100,000 species out of 1.8 million described species, which is 6% of the overall biodiversity. 40% of all fishes, while 1/3 of all vertebrates are being supported by the freshwater resources of the world. Limnetic freshwater ecosystem is also called limnetic ecosystems. So marine versus limnetic, there is a difference. So estuarine, marine and limnetic are the three kinds of aquatic ecosystems. So limnetic ecosystems can be divided into lentic versus lotic. Lentic biomes are stagnant waters such as ponds, lakes, etc., while lotic biomes encompass running waters such as streams, rivers, etc. Now, if you look at the lentic system, the lacustrine habitat, or the habitat of the freshwater lakes, ponds, wetlands and so on, can be divided into different zones. So, the zones which is quite near to the periphery of the lake, so ponds, is known as littoral zones, while towards the center of the pond or lake is known as limnetic zone. So, littoral zone tend to be shallow in depth, and it's very near to the coastal region, while limnetic zone tend to be more deeper. So, in both littoral as well as limnetic, first few meters of the water is called Photic Zone. So, the Photic Zone is a zone in which the sunlight penetrates in. So, that is the only location where algae can live in. So, algae and phytoplanktons can live only in the Photic Zone naturally. While littoral zone is entirely photic, limnetic zone only first few meters of photic. And also you should know that the Photic Zone depth is dynamic. So, it also depends upon the season. So, in the case of India, in the monsoon season, where a number of the water gets drained, the drainage gets a lot of sediments, so that actually brings up the turbidity of the water with the sediments of the nearby area, the land sediments. So, it narrows down the Photic Zone during the monsoon seasons, while the other season the Photic Zone is a bit more deeper. Finally, towards the bottom of the lake is a zone called Profundal Zone, and the lake bottom is known as Benthic Zone, similar to the marine zonations. First is Littoral Zone, shallow, entirely photic and most diverse. Some of the freshwater diversity of the Littoral Zone is include algae, periphyton, which is complex mixture of the algae, cyanobacteria, bacteria, detritus and attached to the submerged surfaces, moss, aquatic plants like water lilies, hydrilla, water hyacinth, lotus, etc., snail, tortoise, ducks, swans, snakes, fungi, viruses and so on. Coming to the limnetic zone, deeper towards the center of the lake, only the surface layers are photic, while bottom layers are aphotic, and limnetic zone tends to be less diverse comparing to the littoral zone. Phytoplanktons, zooplanktons, cattleflies, mayflies, planktonic crustaceans like Daphnia, freshwater copepods like cyclops in the surface, lentic fish and decapod crustaceans like shrimps can also be found in the limnetic zone. Now, towards the bottom of the lake is a dimly lit and cool throughout the year Profundal Zone as well as the Benthic Zone. So, Benthic is the bottom substratum, while Profundal Zone is little bit above the Benthic Zone. That is actually part of the water column. Crustacean species, crabs, eels, snails, turtle and various species of bacteria, fungi, protozoa and viruses are part of the Benthic Zone. Coming to the wetlands, which is non-permanent freshwater systems, marshes where no trees are present, swamps, tree species do exist. So, wetlands can be of two types or three types rather, marshes, swamps and bogs. So, marshes are where no tree species are present, swamps do contain the tree species, while bogs are certain plant species that exudate acidic secretions, that actually smells, very tangible smell you can feel when you go to the bogs. So, that slows down the decomposition of the detritus. So, that is a kind of an adaptation and the characteristic unpleasant smell. Now, coming to the Lotic system, which are running freshwater ecosystem, streams that is nothing but narrow percolating channels and that percolate through the rocks and pebbles in the mountains. Streams and runoff drains join to form the rivers. The riverine ecosystem can be divided into various zones again. Source zone, where the river is originator, the catchment area of the rivers. Transition zone, where the river flow at a high velocity down the mountain. As you can see, most of the world's dams are in transition zones. Floodplain zone, where river flow slows down and is low lying, forming a delta around. River mouth, where it drains into a large body of water, typically the ocean. Rivers and streams have unique ecosystems thriving along its banks, referred as riparian zone, encompassing herbaceous perennials, shrubs and trees as typical vegetation. Now coming to the groundwater aquifer, it is subsurface stored water, inconspicuous subterranean freshwater ecosystem with a rich, dark adapted biodiversity estimated to be around 100,000 species. Chemototrophic bacteria, minute arthropod animals called stegobites or stegobionts, taxa competing its entire life cycle in subterranean groundwater such as Niphargus equifex, Paracardia, Prosobranchia, Syncadia, Ostracoda, Tricladia, Acari, Temnocephalia and so on. These are some of the unique varieties of the aquifer ecosystems. Now coming to the glaciers and ice sheets, Antarctic and Greenland sheets occupy almost like 98% of the freshwater resources of the planet, which is around 2 kilometers thick. Glaciers and ice sheets do contain ice and snow algae, including pink ice algae Chlamydomonas nivalis, cyanobacterial mats and other psychrophilic bacteria. Psychrophilic bacteria are cold adapted, cold loving bacteria. Subglacial Antarctic lakes have rich limnetic biodiversity of bacteria. Subglacial lakes are the lakes which are below the glaciers of the Antarctica. Networks of subglacial riverine systems and biodiversity remains virtually unknown. But these kind of riverine systems have been documented underneath the ice sheets of the Antarctica, which connects one subglacial lake to the another subglacial lake. So you can see here this particular slide, I have taken these photos during my last Antarctic trip. So one you can see on the left side is it's a lake in an Antarctica on a totally frozen condition, while on the right is I'm standing above the East Antarctican ice sheet. Of course, the world's freshwater biodiversity are under tremendous threats because of the anthropogenic activities. So lentic systems are less voluminous and fragmented, containing high percentage of the endemic species, and because of this extremely vulnerable to the threats. So lentic system, as you see, it's like lakes and ponds, and which are of course very small in size, and because of the low gene flow and interhabitat variation, there are a lot of local radiations in these lentic systems. Most of the lentic systems are situated in low lying valleys, and because of this particular location, they are the receivers of the anthropogenic pollution, especially the runoff water. So when you pollute the nearby location, all the water, the drainage comes down to the low lying area where this particular lentic ecosystem like lakes and ponds are there, so they receive most of the pollutions. Over exploitation is there another problem, and unsustainable fishing practices is also a big problem with with regard to the aquatic biodiversity. Freshwater crocodiles, river dolphins, 32% of the amphibians etc. are on the verge of the extinction. Unsustainable free fishing practice include fishing with no due regard paid to the life history stage of the fish. So if you fish a juvenile stage of the fish, then the whole fish biodiversity is hampered. And world's aquatic resources receive tremendous amounts of the drainage as banks of the freshwater ecosystems have high pollution and population density. The pollution is extremely high on most of the freshwater resources of the world. For example, you can see the situation in the Yamuna river or river Ganges. Habitat change and destruction. Construction of the dams or flow modifications, construction of the shipping canals lead to the intrusion of the salt water. So most of the shipping canal, for example the Panama Canal, so if you construct this kind of shipping canals, the seawater is intruded into the terrestrial habitats including the freshwater. So that is a big problem, and the construction of these dams and other flow modification things will hamper most of the aquatic freshwater biodiversity, because a number of fish species of the world need to actually swim upstream towards the interior of the rivers to complete its life cycle. One example would be salmon. So if you hamper the flow, the upstream flow of these fishes, they can never complete their life cycle, and there is no spawning and it dies off. So it will actually hamper a number of aquatic species. Wetland is once thought to be wasteland but highly specious. So conservation of the wetlands for the human habitable zone, so that kind of conversion is known as reclamation. So reclamation tremendously affect the wetland biodiversity. A number of marine species need upstream migration for spawning to complete its life cycle. With wetlands destructed, these organisms could not complete life cycle and dies. Ramsar Convention is an important international treaty for the sustainable use of the wetlands. Another main problem is species introduction. Deliberate introduction of the freshwater species that outcompete endemic varieties. Endemic species are driven to extinction. Some examples include crayfish plague in the Europe, Nile perch, that is Latus niloticus in Lake Victoria, salmonoids in the southern hemisphere lakes, and so on. There are several documented hotspots of the freshwater biodiversity. These include Mekong riverine system that flows through the China, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia and Vietnam, Amazonian riverine system in Brazil, Congo riverine system in Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, and so on. In India, most famous freshwater biodiversity hotspot is the rivers and wetlands of the Indian Western Ghats. It's a notable hotspot for the freshwater biodiversity in Indian subcontinent. So in summary, world's aquatic resources are extremely limited and it encompasses only 0.05% of the all aquatic resources of the world. So freshwater ecosystems can be divided into either lentic, which is actually like a lake or a pond, which is which is static, and lotic, which is running, like riverine ecosystems and other running water like drains and the streams and so on. Aquatic biodiversity is equally the freshwater biodiversity is found in almost all the freshwater resources of the world, especially on the riverine and lacustrine systems. And lake biodiversity, you can actually see the zones, different zones, as the limnetic zone can be divided into various zonations. And there are a number of threats that the human being is tremendously exerting to the freshwater resources of the world. This includes the pollution, because most of the lentic systems are receivers, because they are actually in the low-lying plains and valleys. So they are the receivers of the drain water. So they actually contain a number of pollutants and excess nutrients that actually cause problems like eutrophication that will lead to anoxia. And another main problem is that these actually, because these are fragmented ecosystem, and most of the lacustrine system, the lake systems, are less voluminous, and they contains a huge number, disproportionate number of endemic species. The endemic species are found nowhere else on the planet, and if something happens to that particular lake, and the whole biodiversity is actually affected, and that will lead to not simple local species extinction, but the global species extinction as well. So it's our responsibility for the sustainable use of the freshwater biodiversity of the world. Thank you.